First shock. Previously, when speaking of the law of 7, it was also referred to as the law of shock. For anything to grow, to develop from one level to another, stage by stage in the right order, a shock is necessary. The place of this shock is indicated at the point mi, far in an octave, or place of the missing semitone. So what example can be found of such growth, evolution, or development, stage by stage, in the correct order? It can be found in nature, with the evolution of a microscopic cell into a living, breathing human being. This provides an illustration of evolution through stages of successive transformation, with one thing becoming an entirely different thing, or one thing belonging to one domain, a cellular realm, passing into another, the world of humankind, through a dual process of differentiation and integration. Realize that our birth stands far away, not merely in time, but in vertical scale upon Jacob's ladder, representing an order of things in the union of two minute cells, in a world beneath that in which we live. A world that is ordinarily invisible to us. However, the law of 7 applies to all worlds, from starry galaxies to man and to cells alike, just as the law of 3 does, for these two laws are the creative and formative laws behind the universe and everything it contains, on every level. They are ultimate laws in the sense that they cannot be reduced further, to anything simpler. The law of 7 demands the existence of a shock. We can therefore be certain that, as the law of 7 applies everywhere to all things, in all places of creation, whether in the atomic world or cells or of humanity, a solar system, star clusters or galaxies, the necessity for a shock exists. If this shock is not given, then degeneration or death takes place. In the case of a cell, ascending through successive stages in the evolution of itself, to the world of a human being, becoming a visible person, there is a stage where complete alteration of its inner arrangement is demanded, if it is to survive. In this regard, remember that 9 months of our time, in our world, or the world as we know it, is 30,000 times 9 months for the cell. We can calculate that period, recall chapter 4 and the previous commentary. Consider then, the diagram or scale given. The intermediate stages of transformation lie between Re and C. And let's say the stage so, where something intermediate exists, something unfinished and useless. Each do, the lower and the higher, is complete in a sense. They represent more intelligent, ascended points than the intervening notes. Or we could think of them as resting places. But we can see how 2 critical spaces exist in the application of an octave to the evolution of a cell, and then into a human being. The nature of the upper is fairly easy to see. The lower requires some special but ordinary knowledge to understand. When we realize that shocks are necessary throughout the universe owing to the fact that the law of 7 is omnipresent in the most minute and in the most gigantic, we become aware that everything must either make effort to attain its rightful growth and development, or must receive a shock at the right time. Hence we can speak briefly about mechanical shock. Man receives a mechanical shock repeated at very short intervals. This shock is air. We accept the fact that we breathe, just as we accept everything else, without thought. Air enters our lungs where it meets with blood. Here 2 very remarkable trees exist with a vast number of branches and twigs. The blood tree intertwines with the air tree, in the finest branches of the bronchi, but without penetration, and an interchange takes place. An exchange, as oxygen from the air passes into our bloodstream, and carbon dioxide or waste products are exchanged from the circulatory system for subsequent exhalation. This is the shock given to the first octave in man, the octave of the transformation of food. Unless this is given mechanically, if for example it does not start up quickly enough in a baby, then anoxia sets in and that physical organism is incapable of functioning. It cannot work because the shock it needs has not been received. Any midwife will tell you a baby is smacked on its buttocks to provide a shock so it will breathe. Speaking from this perspective, it becomes obvious that we are simply machines. Everything is done for us, and once started up successfully, we run for a certain time. The shock of air is required by animals, all fish and birds. Which means that we see the law of 7 at work in them. Let's again consider the Enneagram, then write digestive system, air system and blood system beside Re, Mi and Fa respectively. Our lungs of course by themselves cannot provide the shock. They can only do so through taking in air. Nor can the air provide a shock, unless there is something to receive it. The air comes into our lungs and then the most valuable part of it, oxygen, is selected and drawn into our bloodstream, the rest being rejected and expelled again in exhalation, which is nitrogen and carbon dioxide. All created things work through shocks, as without these shocks they would begin to die. So we are given a mechanical shock which makes it possible for our body to live, the shock of air. Why do we breathe? Can we live without breathing? Is breathing something mechanical in us, something arranged for us, something provided ready-made? There is a great deal in us not ready-made, not given. Man is created a self-developing organism, and if we reflect on what that means, we realize that we are not ready-made at all. Up to a certain point we are indeed ready-made, however beyond that point we are not. At the same time we are also capable of some evolution, some development, some kind of growth and ascendance beyond the ready-made or mechanical level of our being. As everything is governed by the law of 7, or the law of shock, we may be quite certain that any further development depends upon shock. In other words, we cannot develop beyond this mechanical level without shocks. Our body is working all the time as a machine, transforming physical food into higher and higher substances, substances that make it possible for us to feel, to think and so on. It is doing this by means of the mechanical shock of air, entering the octave of the transformation of food at a certain point, between me and far. However, the rest of our being, by which is meant all that can get beyond this mechanical level, is not functioning. It is not working because no shock is being given in the right place, and in the right way. One lives one's life just anyhow, without the slightest notion that we have to give ourselves a shock, and we could certainly live out our entire life oblivious to this potential, owing to the mechanical shock of air. However, we are created for some higher purpose. As we know, this work teaches that we are capable of giving ourselves 2 conscious shocks beyond the mechanical shock of air, and that unless these shocks are given, an individual remains asleep, then indeed begins to die psychologically. To give up then surrender their will to live. Our real life lies in the psychological, in the development of understanding, of feeling, of thought, of inner perception. If we think that we are simply our body, then we make a great mistake. No amount of attention to our body, working out or health and beauty spas will make it possible for us to give ourselves these 2 further conscious shocks which belong to the psychological or inner side of us. There is no amount of physical exertion of effort possible to provide this. A human being is more than their body, or rather, they are designed to be more than their body. So let's take then the first of these additional shocks. This shock belongs to the intake of impressions, the reception of them and the digestion of them. The shock is called the first conscious shock. In a fully developed and conscious person 3 shocks take place, the mechanical shock of air, which is given, and then 2 additional shocks which are not given, but have to be created. All esoteric psychology is ultimately about the nature of these 2 additional shocks, and the means by which they may be given. They refer to octaves that potentially exist in us that can develop through conscious work. To change, to become different, to transform ourselves, these 2 shocks must be understood and continually given in our daily life. However, initially, as at physical birth, the first conscious shock must be given, and someone in this work must begin to know what it means to give the first conscious shock to their ordinary daily life. Unless we know genuinely something about the first conscious shock, which is called the transformation of impressions, we cannot expect to understand anything about the second conscious shock. Impressions coming into our human mechanism are a form of sustenance, which therefore constitutes the beginning of an octave. In the Enneagram Illustrated, the left angle of the 3-figure or triangle refers to the first conscious shock. The angle on the right refers to the mechanical shock of air. So air comes in on the right side of the Enneagram from outside as a dot, having the hydrogen value numerically of 192. It undergoes certain transformations up to the point me, which are indicated as stages in the diagram shared. Notice that the development and the transformation of air proceeds to the point 2, or me, where the left-hand angle of the 3-figure or triangle lies. It then stops, because a shock is necessary at that point for it to proceed. However, the shock is not given through ordinary circumstances. Something must enter here just as air did in the previous example, to give that shock. What enters at this point 6 is impressions. How we take life. These impressions do not give a shock in the same way as air does, unless they are taken in consciously. The nature of these 2 shocks is therefore different. At the number 3 in this diagram, the shock is passive or mechanical, but at the number 6, the shock has to be active or conscious, the latter marking the first place of conscious evolution or awakening. This is the place where we have to take life, which is incoming impressions, in a new way. This place marks where we have to transform all daily incidents, all of our relations with others. This is the place where we have to transcend our 5 senses and the world as we see it, by introducing something additional. This is the place where we must digest everything that happens to us, where we must form psychological or psychic power, clear vision that selects and on the other hand eliminates, just as our lungs select from the air that what is most useful, and eliminates or expel what is useless. This is where we require to develop an additional sense, beyond the 5 ordinary senses that we are born with. More on this will be discussed later. However, we can see that the Enneagram with all of its possibilities will not work in us, unless all of the conditions inherent in it are fulfilled. When we realize that the law of 7, or law of shock applies to our psychological life, then we begin to see why it is necessary to make continual effort with our inner or psychic states. If we do not give the necessary shocks to these psychological octaves, there will necessarily be a demise or degeneration of mind and of feeling, just as if the mechanical shock of air were not given at birth, there would be a death through anoxia of our material body. Psychological effort, psychic shock, is of many different kinds. The receiving of impressions in a new way, not taking things always in the same manner, taking in new impressions through directed attention, these are some of the aspects that belong to that first conscious shock, which can be summed up as work on being and work on knowledge. When the work begins to act on us and is no longer simply some theoretical idea, a dogma being presented, when we begin to see how it applies to us directly in ourselves, when we personally relate to some of the many meanings of giving that first conscious shock, which is loosely referred to as self-remembering, or being conscious of the self at the place of intake of impressions from our external world, we can then understand how many sides belong to this shock and how varied it is. At the same time, we should realize what it means to live more consciously in the midst of life. When we have begun to realize something of all this, then we will look back on the way we used to live, when we reacted to everything mechanically, with something akin to horror. We will feel that we would like to have been able to live more consciously in our past life and realize that we have been born again, that we are now among the twice born. We should then begin to catch a glimpse of how we have lived, and how we might have lived instead. The extraordinary thing is how precisely it is all formulated diagrammatically, how simply it is when we begin to invest the diagram with meaning, with our own thought and understanding, to apply our own narrative and commentary, applying it to our personal experiences. No longer taking it as something on the screen that we simply stare at. The diagram is all living, all full of meaning. The words, the letters, the figures and lines are really sources of meaning once our understanding combines with them. It is like a map which refers to real living countries, not just graphics on a monitor.